Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So I want to say something this evening about the understanding and proper use of terminology in the Buddhist teachings. When you rely on English translations of the suttas, and some of the English translations now are very good. We now have some very excellent translations, but no translation is ever going to be perfect. It's impossible. There is an underlying structural problem that no two languages are ever going to be completely isomorphic. Isomorphic is a term from mathematics. It means that two sets have a one-to-one correspondence. Like if you have a deck of cards, the suit of clubs and the suit of hearts are isomorphic because you have a one-to-one correspondence. There's an ace in each suit and a jack in each suit and so on. But if you have, let's say, the chance cards from Monopoly, that's not isomorphic to a set of playing cards. You can't line them up one by one and make a match. So it is with languages. All human language is an expression of thought, and it's a vehicle for putting thought into transmissible form. And every language has developed in specific historical, cultural circumstances and has its different nuances. And there are some words that are completely untranslatable, and there are other words that might have an overlap, but they're not exactly the same as the translated word. So this is not an insurmountable problem if you're aware of it and you make an effort to understand some of the technical terminology in Buddhist discourse. It's like any other field of knowledge you want to acquire. You need to learn a technical jargon. If you set out to be an electrician, you have to learn all kinds of terms like volt and ampere and coulomb, and there's all these specific technical terms that you need to be able to understand and to use to talk about the field. So it is with a developed school of thought like Buddhism. When the Chinese began to pick up Buddhism and they were importing texts from India, in the first few generations, the translations would leave most of the terms untranslated. Common words like the common verbs and adjectives and so on, they would translate into Chinese, but all the terms that refer to states of consciousness or anything that had at all a specific meaning for the teaching would be left in Sanskrit and just transliterated into Chinese syllables. So that would make them very difficult to read without study and training in this vocabulary. But it was one way of avoiding the confusion that comes from translated material. And we now, in our time, the problem is sometimes multiplied because there are some texts, particularly from Mahayana schools, the Sanskrit originals are lost, and we have only in either Tibetan or Chinese translations. And then you read them in English that's already been translated through two languages. The Vimutti Magga is like that. It's actually a very good meditation manual from the Abhayagiri monastery in Sri Lanka, which was a rival to the Mahavihara monastery. And it's actually a very good book about meditation, and many people prefer it to the Visuddhimagga, but it's sometimes difficult to get what they're saying because it's been translated through two languages. The original was lost. It was preserved in China in Chinese, and then it's translated back into English. We're a bit more fortunate in the Pali scriptures because the Pali survives. So as we're reading English translations, it's only been translated once from Pali directly to English. It's also maybe somewhat easier for anyone speaking a European language like English or German or French, because Pali is an Indo-European language, so there's some familial relationship in the grammar. Although the grammar is highly inflected, English was also highly inflected when Beowulf was written, and it's flattened, it's lost its inflections, but it still has that remembrance of that. I've often thought it must be difficult to translate the Buddhist scriptures into Thai, for example. Entirely different grammar. But the main concern for the student, anyone reading Buddhist scriptures or listening to teachings about Buddhism, is to understand some of the vocabulary. And there are many words that are not exactly right in English, but we do the best we can. But you'll get a better understanding if you have some understanding and basis of the original meaning and connotation of the Pali words that lie behind them. There are many, many examples like this. When I speak about samatha meditation, I've often made the comment that translating samadhi as concentration is very wrong and very misleading, and actually damaging to people's meditation practice. To get the wrong idea. But unfortunately, that's become standard. And this is another thing that happens with translations, is that certain terms become standard translations. And samadhi, translated as concentration, is very misleading. So that's a word that I think it would be best, example, to leave it untranslated. We just talk about samadhi, which really means stillness, stability. It's defined as non-moving or non-wavering. There's no implication, as there is with concentration, there's an implication of the mind being reduced to a point, which is completely wrong. With samadhi, the mind should be vast. It's expansive. We don't attain samadhi by reducing the mind down to the point, but by expanding the mind, but not allowing it to waver and move from object to object. That samadhi is the stability of the mind, the stillness of the mind, and this vast space of consciousness being filled by the object. Dukkha is another one that's very difficult to translate, and a lot of people have commented on this and come up with other suggestions. Its standard translation is suffering, which works in some contexts, and in others it's quite misleading for two reasons. One is that suffering only references the subjective aspect, like a being suffers, but dukkha is said to be an inherent quality of the object. So a non-living, non-sentient object can't be said to be suffering. So that word is not quite right. The other reason it's not a perfect translation is that even from the subjective side, dukkha is present in every moment of samsaric consciousness. But that's misleading. It doesn't mean that our lives and our experience is entirely suffering, even though it's entirely dukkha. We do have, in the human form, we do have some actual suffering, but we also have some pleasure and a lot of neutrality, just neutral, boring, neither pleasure nor pain. But these are all aspects of dukkha. So many different things have been tried for dukkha as a translation. Unsatisfying, unsatisfactory, imperfect, stress. That's Tenisaro's suggestion. And he makes it clear in some footnote that what he means by stress is not psychological stress, which is what people assume. When he explains it, it actually makes sense, but people take it the wrong way. I think it misleads people. He doesn't mean psychological stress. He means stress in the engineering sense, like one member of a bridge weighing down, bearing against another. But in the last analysis, no single English word is going to actually capture the real meaning of dukkha. You have to approach it from many angles and think about it and study it and try to understand it in its own terms. Dukkha is really untranslatable. Another one is nibbida. That's a real difficult one that's caused a lot of problem for translators. Nibbida is one of the states in the progression leading to full liberation. The sequence is knowledge and vision of things as they are, yatabhuta jnana dasana, then nibbida, viraga, dispassion, then nirodha, cessation, and then vimukti, liberation. Nibbida is the first disenchantment of the mind or discontent of the mind with samsaric becoming and the movement away from this innate urge to keep taking objects. So disenchantment is actually probably not bad in some ways. It's a little too highfalutin to really catch it. Some of the older translations use revulsion, which is overly strong and has such a negative flavor to it. Although it could be said that at the stage of nibbida there is a kind of subtle aversion, it's not adequately expressed by revulsion. So this is another word really that there is no perfect translation for, and it's no good looking for ideal translations for these kind of words because, as I said at the outset, the languages are not isomorphic. There is no English concept of nibbida. so that there's no word that will express it properly. And sometimes words in Pali have somewhat different meanings or different nuances depending on context. And I want to focus particularly on Sankhara and Dhamma and how these words are used and what they mean. There's a passage, I think it's in the Anguttara, I can't recall exactly where it's from, but it's incorporated in the morning chanting they often do at Thai monasteries. Is Sabbe Sankhara Anicca, Sabbe Sankhara Dukkha, Sabbe Dhamma Anatta, which is Sabbe is all, so it's all sankharas are dukkha, all sankharas are anicca, and all dhammas are anatta. And this is actually a quite profound summary of the teachings. You have the three characteristics of dukkha, anicca, anatta. Dukkha I've already spoken about a bit. We can just say suffering for now for convenience. So all sankharas are suffering. All sankharas are impermanent, anicca. And impermanent is actually a pretty decent translation. It's pretty literal translation from anicca. A in Pali is the negative prefix, and Anicca means eternal, abiding, everlasting. So anicca is impermanent. And all dhammas are anatta, are not self. So this not only expresses the three characteristics, but it expresses on a second level a difference between sankhara and dhamma. These two terms have quite a lot of overlap, but they are distinguished. So to begin with sankhara, this comes from the root karoti, to make or do, and the prefix sang is combining form that means something like together with or combined with, associated with. So sankhara is literal translation, meaning is something built up or constructed. The Sanskrit is sanskara, Pali is sankhara, and in its broadest meaning, and it has in different contexts, it has broader or narrower reference. In the broadest meaning of sankhara, every conditioned thing is a sankhara. And this expresses the teaching of the dependent arising, or the interdependency of all phenomena. That nothing exists as a self-contained, self-sustaining entity. Everything only exists as a reflection of other things, which are themselves the same, reflections of other things. In the Abhidhamma, it's expressed as nothing arises without a cause, and nothing arises from a single cause. In the simple formula of the dependent origination, it's expressed as this arising, that comes to be, this ceasing, that ceases. This concept of the interdependence of all things is one of the ways of expressing the emptiness of things, because there's no self-substance, no self-essence in anything. It only exists as an intersection of vectors of all these other forces and qualities in the universe. But when we look at it, it's actually nothing there. It's just a momentary reflection of all these causes. The Huayan school of Chinese Buddhism, its primary text was the Awatangska Sutra. Their entire teaching is really centered on this. They really elaborate this idea of interdependence. But is found in the oldest teachings in the Pali, this idea. That's why things are called sankharas, because they're constructions. The usual translation is formation. Bhikkhu Thanissaro uses fabrication. But in any sense, it means things that are compounded by external factors. So everything in samsaric existence can be classed as a samsara in this broadest use of the term. Another use of the word in a narrower reference is in the list of the 5 khandha, the 5 aggregates of being that are in the standard English translation, body, feelings, perceptions, formations, or sankharas, and vijnana, or consciousness. Sankharas here excludes the physical world of matter. We're talking about mental formations. So sometimes it's translated here as mental formations. And these are all the created things of the mind, all the thoughts and emotions, the impulses and the desires, fears, anything that arises in the mind. And it's distinguished here from the other mental aggregates as well. There's consciousness, which is that which knows. There's feelings, vedana, which is the initial emotive reaction of pleasant or unpleasant or neutral. And there's perception, or sanya, which is the mental quality that takes the input from consciousness and recognizes or perceives the actual external world. So sankhara here is used in a much narrower sense to one certain category of the constituents of a being. And this teaching of the 5 khandhas in the Abhidhamma is divided up differently. The Abhidhamma generally divides reality into 4. There's the body, which is exactly overlapped with the Rupa Khandha. There's Chitta, which is pretty much equivalent to vijnana, or consciousness. That could be a topic for a whole nother talk, to get into the nuances and the controversies around the meaning of Chitta and the meaning of vijnana. But leave that aside for the moment. And then there's category Chaitasika, which is all the other qualities of mind. So that includes the 3 aggregates of sankhara, vedana, and sanya. So this is best understood as the primary division of the mind is between the consciousness aspect and that which is the object of consciousness. And that includes sankharas. So sankharas are not, in this meaning, sankharas as one of the khandha, is not consciousness. And this is again a problem with language and translation. So the word consciousness in English is not well defined and is used by different writers and different thinkers and speakers in different ways, and it become very confusing. A lot of people mix up consciousness with thought or thinking, and there's nothing to do with that. In the five aggregates, vijnana is that which knows, and sankhara is known by consciousness, and sankhara includes thinking. So thinking and also volition are objects of consciousness. They're not themselves conscious. So sankhara can mean this, either all conditioned things, or in the context of the five aggregates, it means mental formations, a certain aspect of mental life. And there's an even narrower sense it's used in the formula of the dependent origination, the paticca samuppada. The first three terms are ignorance, and because of ignorance there arises sankharas, and because of sankharas there arises vijnana, consciousness. And here, sankhara is specifically defined in the text itself as referring to volitional formations. So this is a subset of the previous use of sankhara. It's a narrower use yet. It means when the mind acts with volition, with will. And this is sometimes translated as karmic formations, because the mind, when it acts volitionally, it's creating karma or kama. And that causes effects in the future. And this is the next term, vijnana, which is defined in the text itself as a specific kind of vijnana, patisandhi vijnana, which means that the vijnana of the origin of a new continuum, or rebirth consciousness, rebirth linking consciousness. So because of ignorance in the past, kama was made, and then consciousness will arise in the future in a new continuum associated with the other aggregates. Sankhara here is referring to only those mental formations that are intentional, that karmic making. The Buddha's definition of karma is that it's ultimately made in the mind. That any action we do with speech or with the body, it first originates in the mind. And it has to be volitional and intentional to have karmic weight. Now this was different than the teaching of the Jains, for example. They said the Buddhist karma was one-door karma, theirs was three-door karma, meaning that it's made in body, speech, and mind. So actions of the body, even if they're unintentional and involuntary, create karma. So the example given usually is stepping on a beetle in the dark. For a Buddhist, there's no karma made. For a Jain, there is. He's making karma by killing a beetle. For the beetle, it doesn't make a whit of difference. He's squashed either way. But there is a difference in the definition, in that karma originates in the mind. This is consonant with the Buddhist teaching, which is the very first stanza of the Dhammapada, is the mind is the forerunner, mind is the chief. And this turns the materialist view completely around. And this is a problem many modern people have in appreciating or understanding Buddhism, and particularly teachings of karma, because our culture has very strong bias towards materialism. And sees the Western assumption, the modern, let's say not the Western really, because it's pretty recent, but the modern assumption is that matter is the primary reality and mind somehow arises out of matter. But the Buddhist teaching was that actually mind is the primary reality and matter is secondary to it. In some ways, modern quantum mechanics begins to approach that Eastern view. So we have these three senses of the word sankhara, which are all just differences of range of reference. They don't contradict each other, but they're more narrower reference in each case, either all conditioned things or a class of mental conditioned phenomena, or even a subset of that, those that are associated with volition and that make karma. So you have to be aware of what context sankhara is being used in. Also, I could add there's another somewhat confusing use of sankhara. We often see in modern, and not even so modern, but just later developments in Buddhism, sometimes specific technical terms pick up different meanings in different schools and different traditions. One example of this is the Abhidhamma term bhavanga, which has a very specific meaning in Abhidhamma as the mind in neutral in between moments of cognition. But it's come in Thai forest use, it often means kind of a dullness in meditation. They say you're in bhavanga. So it's related, but it's not exactly the same thing. So sankhara, I found that the confusion arises with people that their exposure to Buddhism was through the Goenka tradition, because they use sankharas to refer specifically to formations in the body. When you do the body sweeping and you notice painful sensations or knots in the body, those are sankharas that arise from previous old karma and express themselves through the body. And in some ways you can see a justification for that, but it's not really the original meaning of sankhara. Then we have the word Dhamma, Sanskrit dharma. And this actually has two very different meanings. Dhamma as a specific object, and I'll get into that a bit more, and Dhamma in the broader sense as the teaching, or we talk about the Dhamma or Buddha Dhamma. The teaching or doctrine of the Buddha is the Dhamma or the Dharma. There's not really an obvious or direct relation between these two meanings. It's more like the word is a homonym. If there's any connection, it could be just on the basis of that which is true or that which is real. But it has quite a different connotation in both cases, and it's just best to keep them separate. English printed texts, often Dhamma as the teaching is distinguished from Dhamma as an object by the use of a capital letter. But you have to remember this is entirely a recent affectation, because Pali was not a written language, and most of the other scripts in which Pali is expressed, such as Thai and Sinhalese, they don't make a distinction between upper and lower case. It's only really in the Roman script that occurs. So that's an imposition on the original to help distinguish the two meanings, but it's not found in the original. Dhamma, in what the English text with a lowercase d, the small Dhamma, that too has slightly different contexts and meanings. And there's some difference between the way it's used in the sutta and the way it's used in the Abhidhamma, which we often find, actually, the use of language is somewhat different between the two Pitakas. And the general tendency is that the terms used in the Abhidhamma tend to be more precisely technically defined, and the suttas are used in a little bit looser sense, because the suttas, after all, were the recordings of the Buddha's words that he spoke extempore in front of a crowd, and he gave his teachings, whereas the Abhidhamma was more worked out, technical, rigorous, kind of academic approach. The Dhamma in the suttas is mostly used to mean object of consciousness, as particularly the object of mental consciousness, just as the object of eye consciousness is a form, is a rupa, and the object of ear consciousness is a sound, sada. So the object of mind consciousness is a Dhamma. So that which is known by the mind is a Dhamma, the object of consciousness. In the Abhidhamma, Dhamma has a somewhat different meaning, though related. It's the simplest unit of reality. Anything which has an existence in the sense of being momentarily coming into existence is a Dhamma. And there are mental Dhammas and physical Dhammas. It's a kind of atomic view. And in the early days of Buddhism, there were different interpretations of exactly how to define a Dhamma. And this became like a big topic of discussion amongst the early Buddhists. And it was one of the major factors distinguishing the different schools. For example, in the Sarvastivada definition, a Dhamma is a point instant. It has no extension in space and no duration in time. So you have like a point in mathematics is a location on a line, but it has no extension. It's infinitely small, but it has a location in space. That's a mathematical concept, and it's very close to the idea of a Dhamma. And the instant is like that too in time, and it's used in calculus, the infinitesimal. But there becomes philosophical problems to try and define a Dhamma that way. The Theravada defined a Dhamma as it does have extension in space and time, but they're extremely small, unbelievably tiny, which then raises another different set of philosophical issues. So there was a lot of thought and discussion put into the definition of a Dhamma in early days of Buddhism. But what's common to all the traditions is that Dhamma is the simplest unit. It's as far as analysis can go. But the point is clearly made that that doesn't give it a substantial essence. It's still dependently arisen, it's still empty. It's still without a self-substance. It's not an independent occurrence. So then we come around to the difference between Sankhara and Dhamma, and why the text that I quoted at the outset distinguishes that two characteristics apply to Sankharas and one to Dhammas. The first thing to say is that all Sankharas are Dhammas, or composed of Dhammas, but there is one Dhamma that is not a Sankhara, and that's Nibbana. Nibbana, or the unconditioned, is classed as a Dhamma, and this is a meaning of Dhamma, again slightly different, which we could say roughly translated as phenomena. You know? So, but it's not a Sankhara because it's not caused. It's not a compound. It's the uncaused. It's the unconditioned. It's one of the names of Nibbana that's commonly used, is asankhata, unconditioned. So it cannot be a Sankhara, but it's classed as a Dhamma. And then that raises the question of whether Nibbana can be thought of as an object of consciousness, which is another one of the definitions of a Dhamma, at least in the Suttanta. And this, again, is a point of some discussion, but I think that a discussion at this level becomes fruitless because we're at a point that is beyond analytical speech. Whether it has any meaning to say in Nibbana, whether they're subject and object, whether that has any meaning, it's questionable. But we do have the statement that every Dhamma is not self. And the broader meaning of not self is empty or sunya. So Nibbana is also empty. It's also sunya. It's without substance. It's not a thing. And how could it be? It's unconditioned, unborn, uncreated, unmade. So this quality of emptiness is actually the most universal characteristic because it applies to both samsara and nibbana. It applies to all sankharas and all dhammas. Then finally, last point, just for completeness, to mention the other meaning of the word Dhamma that's used in Roman script with a capital D is Dhamma as the teaching. And this too, we could distinguish two levels to it. There's the Dhamma as a universal truth, whether it's known or proclaimed or not. And there's the Dhamma as the actual teaching of the Buddha. As the Buddha himself said, he didn't invent the Dhamma, he discovered it. Just as if someone found an ancient city in the jungle and cleared away the weeds and vines and found this ancient city. So he discovered something that's already pre-existing, that's already real, but it had not been known for some time and not expressed. But then his formulation of it and his way of expression and the teaching that he developed over 40 years and up and down the length and breadth of northern India, this was the Dhamma as a teaching, which we still have existent today, the formalized or expressed or verbal Dhamma, which is an expression of the ultimate truth, put in as far as possible, an approximation of ultimate truth put into words. And the whole intention of the Buddhist teaching is not to express metaphysical theories or expressions, but to lead and guide the practitioner to find out for himself or herself what reality is, to find liberation through your own efforts. And the Buddha often said, I teach suffering and the end of suffering. And he would refuse to get involved in metaphysics, talk about things like the origin of the universe or the ultimate nature of things. He was not concerned about that. He thought it was not fruitful. Which of course didn't stop his followers in developing later all kinds of theories and perturbations of it. So that's some meanings of Sankara and Dhamma, and some caution about understanding the meanings of words.
Kanda mayam dhamma kataya sadutaram dadamase sadhu 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 anu